wanted to take some time and show you how I fit a truss rod. I had a couple questions to show the process a little bit cleaner. Wanted to show you how I lay out and then mark and then show you the variety of options that you can use to actually get a truss rod to fit. I think doing a truss rod or carving a top are some of the most intimidating things you can do structurally, but I'll give you a couple different options of how to fit a truss rod here, and you should have really no issues in doing it. Essentially you start with a blank piece of wood, and when I make a Les Paul neck, I'll cut the angle first before I do the actual truss rod. That way I know I've got the right angle. And what you want to do is get some marking tools and line up where you find the center line. So once you got your center line, draw your center line here. That center line is obviously the most important line as you're fitting the truss rod. And you want to get a rough estimate of the different truss rod, of the different length. Usually a truss rod is between 17 and 18 inches for a tele or a Les Paul. There's a couple different truss rods. I want to take a quick second to show you what truss rod I like the best. You've got some of the cheaper truss rods like Grizzly, where it's a barrel end and a shorter 1/4 inch thickness piece. And you've got some really nice truss rods from companies like LMI and Stu Mac. And then I found this truss rod on eBay, and I'll put the link up here. And this truss rod is nice and thin. It's got a short profile, so it doesn't really go too deep into the wood. And the easiest way of lining this up is to back off for about 3/16 for the nut. Mark this in terms of where you're going to be placing it. I've got my approximate truss rod route or drill, or however you want to do it. And if you're just starting out, you're not really comfortable with a router, I think the easiest way to do, and I've done this in the past, is you get a chisel, nice sharp chisel. You get your mallet, and you just start going down and popping the chisel down, a little bit each time. Go all the way down, and then use a router planer, set the depth properly and clean it up. Obviously this method takes a little bit longer, but it's safe. It's really easy. Another way is you can go to the drill press and drill some relief holes down to the depth of the truss rod, and then go back and clean it up with the chisel if you're looking for a little bit, to save your time and you don't have the right router bits. This chisel plane, I think, was $40. It's helpful in a lot of different situations when you don't want to pop out the router. If you get a good set of chisels, like these Narix chisels, it's a pretty quick process. The other way of cutting the truss rod is with a router. And with this router, I've got a routed edge, I've got a 1/4 inch bit. Essentially flop this down, clamp it down obviously to my workspace. Make sure that I've got some safe routing going on here. Essentially just push it up and down, and it's pretty easy to do. This is my new method of routing truss rod, is with this router. Specifically bought it with this edge. It's a big fat edge, it's not going to move. The third option to route a truss rod then is, even before you make the angle cut, and if you've got a flat bottom and you're not trying to maximize your wood output, so you get a straight edge and pop the straight edge down and get the straight edge lined up, and then go back, get it lined up with obviously a 1/4 inch bit, and you pass it through, and you can have some feather blocks or you can use your hand, and you just pass it through on a overarm router. Or if you've got a table router, on a table router you would do the same thing. You would set up a straight edge, like voila, And then you would go from the bottom side, make sure your depth is set correctly, and you would pass along the piece, as long as it's flat, along a table router. I think the table router or the pin router is safe, but the only problem is you gotta make sure that you've got a featherboard on each side so you don't move it back and forth. That's a big concern as you're routing the truss rod channel, that you don't want to have any gaps. The other option, if you have a table saw, is to get your fence set up, get your height set up correctly, and pass the piece of wood through the table saw and just adjust the fence to get to the correct 1/4 inch size. Now, just a brief recap. Number one would be, chisel and a hammer, or a mallet with a router plane, or if you've got a 1/4 inch chisel, you can help clean up the inside. My biggest advice would be just to go slow. Take your time, have some patience when you're doing this. You don't want it to be sloppy. I've got some guitar necks where you're moving too fast, you're a little bit sloppy, you get a little bit of an edge, and you want your work to look good. So if you got the drill press, drill it out, allows the chisel to work faster. And even I drill it out if I use the table router method or the pin router method, the overarm router method. The only method I probably won't pre-drill is if I do the table saw. I've done them all. Honestly, cutting this by hand sometimes goes pretty quickly if you've got a softwood like mahogany. The biggest thing as you're doing this is to take steps. Don't try to do it all in one pass. So when you're using a chisel or a router or the pin router or the table saw, you want to take 1/8 inch passes. You don't want to take it all in one full swoop, because if you move or something happens, you won't be able to add wood back in unless you've got a thick enough blank that you can just shave off the top and start over. So take smaller passes than you would think. You won't have as many mistakes, and it'll look a lot better in the end. 3 passes on the pin router or with the router, the handheld router, are pretty easy.